There's no surprise today if we pay closer attention to the geopolitical change. Not only we've seen this political and also economic isolation or polarization around the spectrum, but meanwhile, people are also very concerned about this economic agenda. It's not just about this ongoing competition among the critical members in this economic sense, but it's really about what can we do about the current situation and also about the future. But if you study our show, too often that we have to talk about what happened in the past, particularly some of the well-known and historical figures. And how about George Washington, the first president of the United States of America? What about the leadership style? And in today, when we look at what's happening in America today, how do we examine the leadership style according to the Washington style or a Washington a political function or political rhetoric? It's not only critical to understand the future about the country, but also let's talk about what happened in the past, which can directly influence the current political complication. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Andrew O'Shaughnessy. Professor Andrew O'Shaughnessy is a history professor at the University of Virginia, and he's the author of this amazing book, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire. Well, Professor O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much, Will. It's a pleasure to join your show.
Well, Professor O'Shaughnessy, such an honor to have you on our show as well. As I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, When America Found Its First Great Leader. Again, as I mentioned before, George Washington was the first American president. But even today, when we look at the complication of the American political system, we still need to talk about George Washington. So for the first question I want to ask you is, your article highlighted George Washington's initial lack of experience and the challenge he faced upon arriving in Boston. How did Washington's understanding of leadership evolve during the siege of Boston, and what specific action demonstrated their evolution? Your thoughts?
Well, Washington was the best known American soldier at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. He arrived at the Second Congress wearing his uniform, which was very symbolic. But even though he had quite a bit of experience in the French and Indian War, it was very mixed. He'd had real setbacks. He'd been criticized, and he'd had no experience of commanding a regiment. So his experience was really quite limited. And he took over essentially a bunch of militia that was organized into what was called the Continental Army. But of course, they were completely untrained. They were all on very short-term enlistments. And Washington really had to just make do with what he had. But what they did have were numbers, and they'd surrounded the British Army in New York. And it would be a case of really his patience and also consulting a lot with his war council. There were times he wanted to be much more impulsive, much more aggressive, but he did act on the advice of some of his subordinates.
Well, again, Professor O'Shaughnessy, let's talk about the revolution, or if we call it the evolution, that under George Washington. There is no surprise that when we study American history, the word independence was so critical. And also today, when we look at the geopolitical change or even the complication of the politics in the States, the word independence, the word freedom, democracy continue to resonate with a lot of American voters today. But I want to go back to the article. In the article, you also showed that George Washington was initially very much concerned about readdressing the grievances rather than seeking independence. Can you walk us through regarding this journey? Why was it so critical for Washington to go after or to readdressing the grievances rather than pushing for independence? What was George Washington trying to accomplish back in the days? Your thoughts?
So when the war broke out, America had not declared independence. It was almost over a year before America finally, Congress signed the Declaration of Independence. And up until that point, they regarded themselves as fighting a war for the redress of grievances, and they took that quite seriously. The possibility that there might be a rapprochement, an agreement with the British. There were members of Congress who were not keen to sign a declaration and who wanted still to hold out hope and sent an olive branch petition to George III. Washington seems to have concluded that independence was inevitable. Of just how long it took for many patriot leaders to come to what later seemed the inevitable conclusion of breaking away from Britain. They really were quite conservative. One book title I love is Reluctant Rebels. And they really felt the British had been the aggressors. They'd changed the terms upon which America was governed, and they saw the potential for tyranny in British policies, especially keeping an army in Boston and sending troops out to Lexington and Concord. But for Washington, the spilling of blood, I think, was the turning point.
Professor O'Shaughnessy, when we study George Washington, we know that, well, the old saying goes that try not to judge the book by its cover. We know that from this physical appearance, that George Washington might not be the outstanding figure. But when we look at George Washington's personality, again, as a leader in the military, as a president for the country, especially when the nation stood at the crossroads. So my next question to you, Professor, is how did you believe or how did you think that George Washington's personality indeed shaped George Washington? And also, what was some of the major characteristics that really helped George Washington to determine his desire to win the war, win the revolution, and also eventually agreed to be the first president for the nation? What do you say to that?
Well, he was fortunate that he was very tall. John Adams joked that all the leaders in America were tall, and there's been some evidence of that historically. He had a commanding presence, and he stood very erectly. He was a wonderful equestrian. He was also, at least seemed to contemporaries, to be quite distant and slightly intimidating manner. He'd also been he loved to watch plays and had been an actor when younger and understood the importance of symbolism, of propaganda, and was just going into Congress wearing his uniform, the only man wearing a uniform, was a statement. Later, there was a marvelous moment when the officer corps rebelled after the Battle of Yorktown at Newburgh in New York. And Washington quelled the rebellion. And he did it by appearing in front of the officers and sitting down and slowly putting on a pair of glasses and saying that the war had taken its token and he'd grown weary with war, and there was hardly a dry eye in the room. This was someone who could play to the audience. I think that some of his most important and greatest skills was that he wasn't just a military leader, but very savvy politically and excellent at dealing with Congress. And that was essential. He needed Congress to fund his army, and Congress was often, as it is today, very exasperating. His army went unpaid for long periods. Congress wouldn't extend enlistment periods, which he desperately wanted in order to have experienced long-term soldiers. But again, this quality of patience, of careful negotiation, stood him in great stead. And I talk a bit in the article about some of his rivals and some of the other people who he considered of the revolution.
Well, Professor, let's go back to the article. Your article emphasizes the importance of George Washington's creation of the naval force. And of course, today, when we look at the naval force, especially under the current administration, I mean, it's not just about the naval force, military in a greater sense, that actually are playing in a much greater role. And again, we're seeing this how sitting US President Donald Trump continued to deploy the military, the National Guard, to major cities, and the whole purpose was to reduce the crime rate. But again, going back to the period of George Washington, he is a believer of the naval force. Now, the question to you is, what does this initial review about George Washington's strategic thinking and his understanding of the broader scope of the Revolutionary War beyond the immediate siege? How did the naval force play a role for the revolution under George Washington?
So Washington, about this time 250 years ago, was beginning to collect ships to help in the siege of Boston. And some of these ships became the first ships in the Continental Navy, which was created later. But throughout the war, Washington showed an appreciation of the naval dimension of the war, sometimes forgotten even by historians, and realized that it would be critical. America's own naval force, they built some 8 or so ships for the first years of the war, was quite remarkable. But what he really recognized was the need for the French Navy and the major role that would play. And I think he was one of the very few commanders and politicians who appreciated that. Another, surprisingly, was the landlubber John Adams. He also appreciated this dimension and, of course, was sent as one of the representatives to France during the war and saw this element as essential. And what Washington recognized was that a strong French fleet off the coast, working with the American army, could essentially surround and defeat a British army, which is exactly what happened at the Battle of Yorktown. And there had been a couple of earlier moments when something similar might have happened and the war might have ended before Yorktown.
Professor O'Shaughnessy.
The French often disappointed him. And they were more concerned with the Caribbean and revenging the 7 years, or what is known in America as the French and Indian War. But Washington never lost patience, whereas others really grew very frustrated with the French. He understood the importance. And in appointing the Marquis de Lafayette, Lafayette was not only a gifted commander in his own right, but he was also a major conduit to France.
Well, Professor O'Shaughnessy, I understand that you have a new book coming out. So can you talk a little bit more about your new book and what inspired you to write this book? Go ahead.
Yes, it's to be published this month, and it's called Republic and Empire, Revolution, Crisis, and America's Early Independence. It's co-authored with a colleague, Trevor Bernard, and I like to call it Hamlet without the Prince. It's about all the other colonies in the British Empire during the American Revolution, and it does not have the usual description of events in America like the Boston Tea Party, but what it does do is tell us what we can learn about the American Revolution by looking at such places as India, the British Caribbean, Quebec, Ireland, and it allows us to do a number of things, look at British policy in a broader way to see exactly what the British were doing across their empire. It gives coherence to their policy by looking at it that way. And we also see how they were singling out America. They're quite obsessed with America, despite issues in lots of other parts of the empire. It allows us to prioritize the causes of the American Revolution by looking at those factors that were present in America and other parts of the empire, especially Ireland and the British Caribbean, but they remain loyal. They want as much autonomy as possible, but within the British Empire. And it really allows us to understand the war a great deal better because we see it in its international context. The last battle of the American Revolution was fought in India.
Well, Professor O'Shaughnessy, that sounds like a very fascinating book. I have two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about the colonial period way before 1776. Again, going back to George Washington, I'm very glad that previously you mentioned about John Adams, and also I know in the article you also talk about John Hancock and also, of course, Charles Lee, and we're looking at so many founding fathers. But one thing continue to puzzle the readers. Of course, you are the historian and you study history. We were very puzzled or fascinated about the relationship between George Washington and with some of the founding fathers. So, Professor O'Shaughnessy, can you briefly explain to us how would you describe the relationship between George Washington and with some of the other founding fathers like John Adams and, John Hancock? How did he balance the political disagreement or even perhaps the dispute among all of them? I mean, the goal was to seek revolution, was to seek independence, but we understood there might be some conflict, there might be some internal disagreement. How did George Washington handle those disagreements or disputes within the circles? Your thoughts?
He was on the whole very supportive of the other founders. An interesting case study is Thomas Jefferson. And he befriended Jefferson. They were both fellow Virginians and planters. And he was, Jefferson was criticized for not providing more for the defense of Virginia when Cornwallis's army invaded in 1781, and even accused of cowardice by his own legislature for running from Monticello as British troops advanced. And Washington was immensely supportive of him. They did fall out politically in the 1790s with the emergence of parties, the Federalists and Republicans. And, sadly, the friendship did not last. But it's interesting that Jefferson in later life, when the first year of students at the University of Virginia would go to Monticello, the person that he loved to reminisce about, the man he loved to talk about most, was George Washington. And after Washington, Benjamin Franklin. But Jefferson recognized how critical Washington had been for the success of the American Revolution, and also for the fact that he gave up command at the end of the Revolution, and then stepped back to chair the Constitutional Convention and to become America's first president. These helped to give the country stability. Most revolutions fail.
Professor O'Shaughnessy, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, your article is entitled, When America Found Its First Great Leader. Today, we're seeing the complication of the politics in our nation. Also, we're seeing the complication, the intricacy of the geopolitical change. The last question, very simple, I want to ask you. How do you think that we can define the word great today, or even the greatness within the leader? What are some of the major characteristics that the person must possess in order to be, air quote, qualified to be a great leader? It's not just about the political interest. It's not just about this economic agenda. There's got to be something much deeper beyond those two elements. So you as a historian, you as someone who studied history specifically, how should we give this powerful meaning to the word of greatness when we talk about leadership today? Your final thoughts.
So it's probably fair to say there are a few genuinely great leaders, but one of the qualities is statesmanship, transcending self-interest and acting in the broader interest of the public. Another, I think, is to be a great communicator. And I talked about Washington's thespian skills and some of his speeches, and just the symbolism, of wearing a uniform. Communication is essential, and a lot of leaders have recognized the importance in the development of technology, beginning with newspapers in Washington's era, and obviously today with social media, with television. Roosevelt was one of the first to really use the radio to communicate with the public. Similarly with Winston Churchill, that is an essential element.
Well, I want to borrow a famous quote from former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He once said, "America always knows how to make the best decision after exhausting all the possibilities." When we look at the complication of the American system today, and I hope and I pray that America will continue to make the wise decisions, perhaps we don't really have to come to the point of exhausting all the possibilities. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Andrew O'Shaughnessy. Again, Professor O'Shaughnessy, it's a history professor at the University of Virginia. He's the author of the amazing book, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire. Well, Professor O'Shaughnessy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to study and explore the uniqueness of American history. So thank you so much for doing this.